Rain drifted softly across Cardiff on the afternoon. Perry Vesey disappeared. The kind of cold April rain people barely notice anymore because life keeps moving around it. Buses still groan through traffic. Shop doors still open and close. Coffee cups still steam in tired hands. And somewhere in the middle of all that ordinary noise, a 37-year-old woman walked out of work for the last time without realizing she was already walking toward her own murder. Perry locked the salon behind her around 3 p.m. on Saturday, the 12th of April 2025. CCTV footage later showed her smiling faintly at one of her coworkers before pulling her black zip-up gym jacket tighter against the rain and walking toward her black Mercedes GLC parked nearby. Nothing about the footage looked unusual. No panic, no fear, no sign that less than 2 hours later, she would be dead beneath the hands of the man she once trusted enough to leave her entire country for. But the terrifying thing about stories like this is how normal they always look right before everything breaks apart. Cardiff itself looked peaceful that day. Families walked along the bay. Couples crowded cafes near Canton. The city moved with its usual rhythm, completely unaware that somewhere nearby, a man had already bought the knives he intended to kill his wife with. And maybe that's the detail that haunts this case more than anything else. He bought them before she arrived, not during an argument, not during some uncontrollable emotional explosion. Before. That means there was planning, intention, calm thought. While Perry was finishing work and answering client messages and living through what she believed was another ordinary Saturday, her husband was already preparing the weapon that would end her life. Perry wasn't originally from Wales. Years earlier, sometime around 2010, she had moved from Iran to the United Kingdom with her husband Alireza Asghari. Imagine how terrifying and exciting that must have felt at the same time. New country, new language, new future. Most immigrants understand that strange emotional split between hope and loneliness when you first arrive somewhere unfamiliar. You leave behind family, familiar streets, the sounds of home, and you gamble everything on the idea that life can become something better somewhere else. Perry made that gamble in her early 20s, and by all accounts, she worked incredibly hard to build a real life in Cardiff. She became a hairdresser, which sounds simple on paper until you understand how personal that profession really is. Hairdressers become part of people's lives in deeply intimate ways. Clients sit in front of them talking about marriages, pregnancies, breakups, depression, fears, ambitions. They return every few weeks. Relationships form naturally. According to investigators later, Perry was deeply loved by her clients and coworkers. People trusted her. They liked being around her. One friend described her as the kind of person who made rooms feel lighter when she entered them. And that matters because true crime has a way of reducing victims into headlines, into bodies, into evidence. But Perry wasn't the woman under the garden. She was a real person who built a life from nothing in a foreign country and became important to the people around her. She had dreams. She had routines. She had favorite restaurants and inside jokes and future plans. And underneath all of that, hidden carefully behind normal life, she was also terrified. The public would later learn through court proceedings that Perry had confided in friends about being afraid of her husband. Not frustrated with him, not annoyed by him, afraid. That word changes everything, because fear inside a marriage usually means the emotional damage has already moved far beyond ordinary relationship problems. Friends later described how Perry seemed emotionally exhausted in the months before her death. She had become quieter, more anxious, sometimes distracted while working, yet she kept functioning. That's something many people misunderstand about victims trapped inside controlling relationships. They imagine obvious signs, bruises, public breakdowns, screaming fights. But most abusive relationships survive through secrecy and routine. Victims still go to work, still smile at people, still answer messages normally while privately carrying enormous psychological pressure nobody else fully sees. Perry kept going. Until finally, she made the decision that research shows is often the most dangerous moment in an abusive relationship. She left. In early April 2025, less than 2 weeks before her murder, Perry moved out of the home she shared with Alireza in the Penellan area of Cardiff. She rented her own place in Cathays. New address. New beginning. Friends later said she seemed hopeful again. Nervous, but hopeful. And maybe if you've ever escaped something controlling yourself, you understand how emotionally complicated that stage becomes. Freedom doesn't feel safe immediately. Sometimes it feels terrifying. You second-guess yourself constantly. You wonder if you made things worse. You keep expecting the phone to ring. Perry reportedly told friends she feared what Alireza might do after the separation. And tragically, that fear was justified, because investigators would later discover evidence suggesting Alireza had already been planning her death before she even fully left him. Messages recovered from his phone later revealed conversations with another woman believed to be living in Iran. In one exchange reportedly discussed during court proceedings, prosecutors said Alireza talked about plans for Perry to be killed in Iran. Think about how cold that is psychologically. While Perry was trying to rebuild her life, while she was searching for apartments and working and imagining a future away from fear, the man she once crossed continents with was already discussing her death behind her back. And still, somehow, life continued looking normal from the outside. That Saturday afternoon, Perry finished work around 3 p.m. Co-workers saw nothing unusual. She got into her black Mercedes carrying a small handbag, wearing black trousers and trainers, probably already thinking about what she needed to do that evening. Then, at some point after leaving work, she received a phone call from Alireza. The exact details of that conversation were never publicly released, but whatever he said convinced her to drive back to the house she had escaped less than 2 weeks earlier. That decision would become the final decision of her life. Maybe he apologized. Maybe he manipulated her emotionally. Maybe he promised closure. Maybe he convinced her he wanted to talk calmly one last time. People often ask why victims return to dangerous partners, but relationships shaped by coercive control create emotional confusion outsiders rarely understand. Fear and attachment become tangled together. Hope becomes weaponized. And abusers often know exactly which emotional buttons still work. Around 4:30 p.m., inside the conservatory of the Penellan property, Alireza attacked her. 4 stab wounds, neck and chest. The violence was fast and personal, not random, not detached. The kind of violence driven by ownership and rage at losing control. Perry died inside a house she had already tried to escape. But what happened next is what transformed this case from horrifying into deeply disturbing. Because after killing her, Alireza didn't panic. He didn't collapse emotionally. He didn't call emergency services or confess. Instead, prosecutors later revealed he calmly changed his clothes and went to a leisure center to shower. Just pause on that image for a second. A woman lay dead in the house, and he was washing himself like someone cleaning up after a long workday. That level of emotional detachment terrified investigators later because it suggested something important psychologically. He wasn't overwhelmed by guilt. He was focused on preserving himself. Every action afterward reflected that same terrifying calm. After showering, he purchased cleaning supplies, including bleach. Then he contacted his aunt Mariam Degani in London. She drove to Cardiff to help him. Together, prosecutors later alleged they began covering up the murder, not hiding it temporarily, erasing it. They moved Perry's body into the rear garden, near an area that had once been a pond. They dug into the earth, buried her remains beneath patio slabs, covered the grave with fresh soil, then planted flowers over the top. Flowers. That detail spread across news reports because something about it felt psychologically monstrous. Murder hidden beneath beauty. Violence disguised as gardening. And while Perry lay buried beneath that fresh flower bed, her husband picked up her phone and started pretending she was still alive. He texted her employer. He texted family members. The messages claimed Perry had left the UK and wouldn't have access to her phone for 1 or 2 months. Imagine receiving those messages from someone you love, while they're actually buried beneath concrete only miles away. But here's the thing Alireza didn't fully account for. Perry mattered too much to disappear quietly. The next day, one of her friends contacted South Wales police almost immediately because something felt wrong. Perry wasn't answering properly. The messages sounded strange. The silence felt unnatural. And most importantly, the friend already knew Perry feared her ex-husband. That instinct would become critical because while Alireza believed he was controlling the narrative, people around Perry were already beginning to sense the terrifying truth underneath it. And within days, investigators would discover the first clue proving Perry never left Cardiff at all. Her black Mercedes had been abandoned only minutes away from the very house where she vanished. By Tuesday morning, the atmosphere around Perry Vessey's disappearance had already shifted from concern to something darker, something heavy and deeply wrong that people close to her could physically feel in their stomachs, even before police publicly admitted it. Her black Mercedes GLC had been discovered abandoned on Dorchester Avenue in Penellan, only a short distance from the home she had recently escaped. Rainwater streaked down the windows when officers first approached the vehicle, and inside, everything looked strangely untouched. Her handbag was still there. Personal belongings remained inside. Nothing suggested a woman preparing to leave the country for 1 or 2 months like the text messages claimed. In fact, the car itself immediately destroyed that story. If Perry had truly left the UK voluntarily, why would her vehicle still be parked near the very house connected to the man she feared? Detectives already knew the answer emotionally before they could prove it legally. Something terrible had happened inside that home, and meanwhile, the man at the center of their suspicions continued behaving with terrifying calculation. Investigators later revealed that after helping bury Perry's body beneath the flower bed, Alireza Askari began carefully constructing an alternate reality around her disappearance. The fake text messages were only the beginning. He reportedly spoke calmly with police during initial inquiries, insisting he had no idea where Perry was. Imagine the emotional disconnect required for that performance. Officers stood only meters away from the garden, where her body was hidden, while he calmly denied knowing anything. That level of composure disturbed, even experienced investigators later, because it reflected something profoundly cold inside him. There was no panic, no grief, no emotional collapse, just control. Every movement seemed focused on buying time. But the problem with manufactured stories is that they usually fail under the weight of real human behavior. Perry's family knew her too well. Her friends knew her routines. Her clients knew her habits. People immediately noticed inconsistencies. The messages didn't sound like her. The sudden disappearance felt unnatural. There was no proof she had traveled anywhere. No bank activity, no airport records, no CCTV footage placing her at transportation hubs. Nothing. And slowly, piece by piece, the fake version of reality Alireza created started collapsing. Then came the discovery that changed the investigation completely. On April 15th, police arrested Alireza while he was driving back toward Cardiff from Birmingham. Officers searched his vehicle. Inside, they found canisters of caustic soda. That single detail horrified investigators because caustic soda isn't something people accidentally transport during a missing person case. It's a corrosive chemical capable of breaking down organic tissue over time. Prosecutors later argued the implication was obvious. He intended to destroy Perry's remains completely. Think about how psychologically disturbing that progression becomes. First, the murder. Then, the burial beneath flowers. Then, the fake messages pretending she was alive. And finally, the apparent attempt to erase her body entirely. It wasn't enough for Perry to die. The evidence suggests he wanted her existence itself removed. No body, no grave, no proof, nothing left behind except confusion. That level of calculated concealment transformed the case from emotional violence into something terrifyingly methodical. Detectives now understood they weren't dealing with someone who snapped during an argument. They were dealing with someone capable of planning multiple stages of deception afterward. And still, Through all of this, Perry's loved ones continued desperately searching for answers. Her sister Helia later described the emotional nightmare of those days publicly. One moment you're trying to convince yourself maybe there's still hope, maybe there's some explanation. Maybe she really did leave unexpectedly. The next moment, your body already knows the truth before your mind can accept it. Every phone notification becomes terrifying. Every unanswered call feels heavier. And underneath all of it lives the unbearable thought nobody wants to say out loud. What if she's already dead? South Wales police officially announced the case was being treated as a murder investigation on April 17th. By then, investigators publicly admitted they had no evidence Perry was alive. That statement sent shockwaves through Cardiff because many people had followed the case from the moment friends reported her missing. Perry wasn't an isolated person, drifting quietly through society unnoticed. She was deeply connected to her community. Clients posted photos of her online, asking for help finding her. Friends shared missing person appeals across social media. Coworkers spoke emotionally about how unlike Perry this disappearance felt. And while all of that unfolded publicly, Perry herself remained buried beneath a garden only minutes away. That detail became one of the most psychologically disturbing elements of the case for many people afterward. Life continued above her grave. Traffic passed nearby. Police knocked on the front door. Neighbors moved normally through their daily routines, while beneath freshly planted flowers lay the woman everyone was desperately trying to find. Finally, on April 19th, investigators searched the garden thoroughly. The moment officers uncovered her body beneath patio slabs and fresh soil, the case transformed forever. Even experienced detectives reportedly found the scene emotionally devastating, because by then they already understood what Perry had endured before her death. The fear, the attempt to leave, the manipulation pulling her back, and now this final humiliation afterward, buried secretly by the very person she escaped. News coverage exploded across the UK almost immediately after the discovery. People became obsessed with the details, because the cruelty felt almost impossible to comprehend emotionally. Flowers planted above a murder victim, fake text messages sent from her phone, cleaning supplies, caustic soda. Every new detail made the story darker. But investigators weren't finished uncovering evidence yet. When police examined Alareza's phone, they discovered messages exchanged with a woman in Iran believed to be his girlfriend. Those conversations introduced an even more horrifying layer to the story, because prosecutors later stated that in at least one message, Alireza discussed plans for Perry to be killed in Iran, meaning thoughts about her death existed long before April 12th, long before the final phone call, long before the conservatory attack. That evidence became critical because it reinforced the prosecution's argument that this murder was premeditated, planned, considered. Not impulsive violence during emotional chaos, but something darker and colder. And psychologically, maybe the most disturbing aspect of all was the contradiction at the center of his behavior. While secretly pursuing another relationship himself, Alireza allegedly became murderous over Perry trying to leave him. That contradiction actually reveals something important about coercive control dynamics. It was never about love or loyalty. It was about ownership. Abusive individuals often believe they themselves deserve freedom, while their partner does not. Perry reclaiming her independence represented something psychologically intolerable to him: loss of control. That's why experts on domestic homicide later pointed to this case as a devastating example of separation violence. Research consistently shows victims are at greatest risk immediately after leaving controlling partners, and Perry had only been gone from the house 12 days. 12 days between choosing freedom and losing her life. During court proceedings later, prosecutors described the murder as carefully orchestrated. The knife purchased the same morning became a powerful symbol of that planning. He didn't grab a weapon during a sudden fight. He went out and bought one first. That small sequence changes how the entire crime feels emotionally because it introduces anticipation. He woke up that morning already preparing for violence, while Perry still believed she had a future ahead of her. And what makes the story even harder to process emotionally is how ordinary Perry's goals actually were. She wasn't asking for wealth or fame or revenge. She simply wanted safety, independence, a new apartment, her own space, the ability to breathe without fear. That's it. Those were the things she died trying to protect. As the investigation deepened, public sympathy for Perry grew enormously across Wales. Around 100 people later gathered at the Norwegian church in Cardiff Bay to honor her memory. Friends described her as vibrant, caring, generous, selfless. Clients spoke emotionally about how comfortable she made people feel, and her sister's words devastated almost everyone following the case. Helia described their final video call together shortly before Perry disappeared. She remembered noticing how beautiful Perry's hair looked that day, long and curly and full of life. She didn't know it would become their last conversation ever. That detail stayed with people because grief often preserves painfully ordinary memories forever. The final smile, the final joke, the final casual compliment. Nobody recognizes those moments as permanent while they're happening. Meanwhile, behind bars, Alireza reportedly attempted another manipulation strategy. After his arrest, he claimed he suffered from schizophrenia and heard voices, but the court rejected the narrative completely. The judge later described the claim as cynical manipulation, essentially another attempt to control perception rather than accept responsibility. And that pattern becomes impossible to ignore once you examine the entire case closely. Every stage involved controlling the narrative, controlling Perry through fear, controlling the crime scene, controlling the fake messages, controlling police perception, controlling public reality itself. But despite all of it, despite every lie and calculated action afterward, there remained one thing he ultimately failed to control completely. The people who loved Perry refused to stop looking for the truth. And soon, inside Cardiff Crown Court, the carefully constructed version of events Alireza built around her disappearance would finally collapse completely in front of the entire world. When the case finally reached Cardiff Crown Court in early 2026, the emotional weight surrounding Perry Vessey's murder had already spread far beyond Wales, because by then people weren't just following another true crime headline anymore. They were following the story of a woman who had done everything experts tell victims to do and still lost her life anyway. She had confided in friends. She had left the relationship. She had found a new place to live. She had started rebuilding. And yet somehow, the man she escaped still found a way to pull her back into danger. That reality haunted people following the trial because it forced them to confront something deeply uncomfortable about coercive control and intimate partner violence. Leaving is often the most dangerous moment of all. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors laid out the timeline piece by piece until the full horror of what happened became impossible to emotionally escape. The knife purchase that morning, the phone call drawing Perry back to the house, the attack inside the conservatory, the shower afterward, the bleach, the burial beneath patio slabs and flowers, the fake text messages sent from her phone while she was already dead underground. Every detail added another layer of calculated coldness to the case. And maybe the most chilling thing was how ordinary Alireza appeared throughout much of it. People often imagined killers looking visibly monstrous, visibly broken, visibly dangerous. But many predators survive precisely because they don't look like what people expect evil to resemble. Court observers later described Alireza as emotionally flat during portions of the proceedings, calm in ways that felt unsettling considering the brutality of the evidence against him. Prosecutors argued this wasn't a crime driven by uncontrollable passion. It was control, ownership, punishment for leaving. And underneath all the legal terminology, that truth sat heavily inside the courtroom every single day. Perry died because she tried to reclaim her life. During sentencing, the judge made something very clear. This murder had been planned. Not spontaneous, not accidental, planned. Evidence showed Alareza purchased the knives hours before Perry arrived at the house. The messages found on his phone discussing her death before the murder reinforced that conclusion even further. The court rejected entirely his later attempts to claim schizophrenia and hearing voices. The judge reportedly described those claims as manipulative, another calculated attempt to avoid responsibility after the fact. And honestly, when you examine the full psychological pattern of this case, manipulation appears at nearly every stage. Manipulation of Perry emotionally, manipulation of police through lies, manipulation through fake messages pretending she was alive, manipulation through the staged garden burial, manipulation through false mental illness claims afterward. Every part of the story revolved around controlling perception, controlling reality itself. But what finally shattered that control completely were the people around Perry who refused to ignore their instincts. Friends noticed the silence immediately. Family members recognized something felt wrong about the texts. Detectives followed inconsistencies carefully instead of accepting convenient explanations. And eventually, beneath fresh flowers in a Cardiff garden, the truth surfaced anyway. That became one of the defining emotional themes of the entire case afterward. Evil often depends on silence and disbelief to survive. But Perry's loved ones kept asking questions when it would have been emotionally easier to accept the fake story. They refused to stop searching, and because of that, Perry was found before her body could disappear forever. The courtroom became especially emotional when Perry's sister Helia spoke publicly. Her statements devastated many people following the trial because they reminded everyone that behind all the evidence, all the headlines, all the legal arguments, there existed a family permanently destroyed by loss. Helia spoke about their final video call together before Perry disappeared. She remembered thinking Perry looked beautiful that day, her hair long and curly and healthy. Such a painfully human memory. Not dramatic. Not cinematic. Just ordinary love preserved forever, because nobody realizes when they're speaking to someone for the last time. Helia reportedly thanked investigators and supporters publicly, while also acknowledging something heartbreaking and deeply true. No sentence could ever actually repair what happened. Prison doesn't restore stolen futures. Justice in cases like this is limited. Necessary, yes. Important, absolutely. But limited. Perry was still gone. Her friends still had to continue living without her. Her clients would never sit in her salon chair again. Her family would never hear her laugh again. Those absences remain long after trials end. Alireza Asghari ultimately received a life sentence with a minimum term exceeding 25 years before parole eligibility. His aunt, Mariam Degani, who helped conceal the crime afterward, also received prison time for perverting the course of justice. And public reaction toward her involvement became intense because many people struggled emotionally with the idea of helping bury a murdered woman beneath flowers. Cases involving family members assisting in concealment often disturb the public in uniquely deep ways because they force difficult psychological questions. Loyalty to family, fear, denial, moral collapse. Whatever motivated her involvement, the result was devastating. Every action taken after Perry's death prolonged the suffering of people desperately trying to find her. But perhaps the reason this case resonated so strongly internationally is because Perry herself represented something larger than one isolated tragedy. She symbolized countless victims trapped inside controlling relationships while still outwardly appearing functional and normal to the world around them. She kept working, kept socializing, kept smiling for clients while privately carrying fear many people around her didn't fully understand yet. And when she finally made the courageous decision to leave, she entered statistically one of the most dangerous phases of an abusive relationship. Experts on domestic violence repeatedly pointed toward this case afterward while discussing separation violence because it demonstrated the pattern so clearly. The abuser experiences loss of control. The victim attempts independence. The risk escalates dramatically. Perry's story became a warning wrapped inside a tragedy. But there's another emotional layer to this case people continue discussing even now: the terrifying normality of it all. This wasn't some isolated cabin in the woods or dramatic criminal underworld story disconnected from ordinary life. This happened in a quiet residential area of Cardiff. Neighbors passed by the house normally, while Perry lay buried in the garden. Police knocked at the door while flowers grew above her grave. The horror existed directly beside everyday life, unnoticed, until evidence forced it into the open. And maybe that's why true crime cases like this stay lodged in people's minds so deeply. Because they reveal how much darkness can hide inside ordinary spaces: a family home, a garden, a text message, a normal Saturday afternoon. Everything looks familiar until suddenly it isn't. Even now, people continue discussing one specific psychological detail from the case more than almost any other: the shower afterward. The fact Alireza allegedly showered calmly after killing Perry before buying cleaning supplies unsettled people profoundly because it suggested emotional compartmentalization so extreme it almost felt inhuman. It wasn't simply violence. It was the ability to step away from violence temporarily and focus logically on concealment. That detail changed how many viewed the crime emotionally. It transformed the image from uncontrolled rage into something colder and more deliberate. And still, despite every disturbing detail surrounding her death, many people close to the case continue emphasizing the importance of remembering Perry herself, rather than only the brutality of what happened to her. She was ambitious, social, hardworking. She built a life in a foreign country from scratch. She formed real friendships. She mattered deeply to the people around her. One friend described her as someone who made others feel safe and cared for instinctively. That version of Perry deserves remembrance too, not just the crime scene beneath the flowers. Because true crime has a dangerous tendency to let murderers dominate narratives, while victims slowly become secondary characters in stories about their own deaths. Perry was not simply evidence in a courtroom. She was a woman trying to begin again. And maybe the most devastating part of all is how close she actually was to freedom. 12 days. That's all. 12 days separated her new beginning from her murder. 12 days between escape and death. 12 days between imagining a future and becoming a memorial photo carried by grieving family members outside court. And in the end, perhaps the clearest lesson from Perry Vessey's story is also the hardest one emotionally. Evil doesn't always arrive screaming. Sometimes it arrives through manipulation, through control disguised as love, through apologies and phone calls and promises to talk one last time. And sometimes survival depends entirely on whether people around a victim recognize the danger before it's too late. Perry's friends did recognize it. Her family did. Detectives eventually did. But for Perry herself, the realization came tragically too late. She left work during a rainy Saturday afternoon believing she was driving toward a conversation. Instead, she drove toward the man who had already decided she would never truly be allowed to leave him alive.